morning. The reading this morning is from Romans chapter 14, reading verses 1 to 13. And if you want to follow on the church Bibles, it's page 921, entitled The Weak and the Strong. Accept the one whose faith is weak, without quarrelling over disputable matters. One person's faith allows them to eat anything, but another whose faith is weak eats only vegetables. The one who eats everything must not treat with contempt the one who does not. And the one who does not eat everything must not judge the one who does. For God has accepted them. Who are you to judge someone else's servant? To their own master, servants stand or fall, and they will stand, for the Lord is able to make them stand. One person considers one day more sacred than another. Another considers every day alike. Each of them should be fully convinced in their own mind. Whoever regards one day as special does so to the Lord. Whoever eats meat does so to the Lord, for they give thanks to God. And whoever abstains does so to the Lord and give thanks to God. For none of us lives for ourselves alone, and none of us dies for ourselves alone. If we live for the Lord, and if we die for the Lord. So whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. For this very reason, Christ died and returned to life, so that he might be the Lord of both the dead and the living. You then, why do you judge your brother or sister? Or why do you treat them with contempt? For we all will stand before God's judgment seat. It is written, "As surely as I live, says the Lord, every knee will bow before me, every tongue will acknowledge God." So then, each of us will give an account of ourselves to God. Therefore, let us stop passing judgment on one another. Instead, make up your mind not to put any stumbling block or obstacle in the way of a brother or sister. Amen. Look forward to the sermon.
It is part of the Christian faith to believe that one day the story of this world will come to an end. We don't know when this day will be, although many have tried and failed to figure out the exact date. We don't know what it will look like exactly, the grand finale of history, although many have speculated and come up with all sorts of ideas. But both the Hebrew scriptures as well as the New Testament texts speak of a day that marks the last day of this world. And we call this day Judgment Day. The idea behind this belief that one day God will judge the people of this world is fairly straightforward. Humans throughout history, people of every nation and culture, share the collective experience that our human world lacks justice. No matter when or where you grow up, when you open your eyes and observe the world around you, you will discover that there are people who have it much easier than others. There are people who are born into a wealthy family, have the privilege of growing up, receiving great education, don't know what hunger is, and don't know much about suffering. And then there are others who can just not catch a break. Some people continue to be unlucky, and pain, sickness, and suffering seem to follow them their entire life. Not only that, often those with all the wealth and only have said wealth because they use and abuse other people that they have power over. Sometimes these oppressors like that are held accountable and are brought down, but oftentimes they get away with it their entire lives. And while one ruler passes their power on to the next in line, the fortune of the less privileged doesn't really change. How is it fair that a person, simply by being born in the right country, has better access to food, wealth, education than someone born in a different country? How is it fair that a person who labors away day and night out in a field barely makes enough to feed their family while others barely have to lift a finger? It isn't fair. It isn't right. Now, there have always been people who have advocated for a worldview that says this: well, that's just how life is. There's nothing anyone can or will actually really do about it. Some are lucky and some are unlucky. Do your best to enjoy your life, maybe help where you can. But ultimately, we need to accept the injustice of life and try and make the best of what we have. This is where the ancient Hebrew belief of a judgment day comes in. And this belief says, no, this injustice will not stand. Because the God we know will not allow for injustice to prevail. Our God is a God who sees the poor and weak. Our God is a God who sees the slaves, calls them to himself, and sets them free. Our God stands up for those of us who are broken and forgotten. One day, our God will set things straight. Judgment Day. The Hebrew and New Testament texts say, will be that day. On that day, everyone will have to justify their actions in front of God, who sees and knows all. And then God will set things straight and bring justice to those who have been stepped on and hurt during their lifetime. And so Judgment Day is both a day of fear and a day of hope. It is a day of hope for everyone who has suffered unjustly, who has not had the life they deserved as God's beloved children, who have experienced firsthand how brutal, humiliating, and inhumane people can be to one another. But it is also a day of fear for everyone who has lived a life at the top, who has profited of the pain and struggles of others, who has had an unfair advantage over others and has not used their privilege to be generous and kind to those who are struggling. Paul says, we will all stand before God's judgment seat. Each of us will give an account of ourselves to God. In other words, it doesn't matter, according to Paul, whether or not someone is Christian or Jewish or identifies with any other religion or worldview. No one will be able to avoid that final confrontation with the God of the universe. I don't know about you, but I find that to be a very sobering thought. You and I live our lives under the assumption that one day we will have to explain ourselves to the highest authority imaginable, Paul says to the Christians in Rome. Everyone is responsible for their own actions. Everyone needs to think through the consequences of how they live their life. If that is the case, Paul says, then maybe we can show one another just a little bit more leeway when it comes to the little things. Maybe we don't need to jump down each other's throats about every little thing we disagree over. Paul talks about some of these things that he finds are not worthy arguing over. And these are just examples. There's plenty more. One of these examples is Christians arguing over what food they can and cannot eat. It was common in the ancient world to sacrifice animals to the gods that one believed in. And in a massive and multicultural city like Rome, there would have been many, many sacrifices to many different gods every day. But the meat from these sacrifices would not all be burned and go up in smoke. Large amounts of this meat were sold at a fairly reasonable price after having been sacrificed. And so, as a young and perhaps not too wealthy Christian in Rome, you had to ask yourself, this meat is affordable, but it was sacrificed to honor a God that I reject. Would it be wrong for me to buy and eat this? And there were different opinions about that. Some would have said that the meat is tainted and unholy, perhaps even demonic, and there's no way that a Christian can possibly eat it. What if there's an actual demonic power behind these gods? And what if I let these demonic powers into my life by eating meat that was sacrificed to them? Or, a little less dramatic, what if people think I'm still worshiping these gods in some way by eating this meat? As a Christian, I want to break with all these other gods completely. But aren't I still participating if I buy and eat this food? That was one side of the argument. The other argument, the other thing that Christians said was this: the God this animal was sacrificed to does not actually exist. People made him up. The only God that actually does exist is the one that we believe in. So food is food, no matter what other people might have thought when they killed the animal. And all the food in this world, at the end of the day, is food provided by our loving Father in heaven. So buy the meat, be grateful to your God for giving it to you, and then enjoy eating it. Does it surprise you that early Christians might have big arguments over this? I think if you've spent any time, any extended period of time in Christian churches, you know that people can get into the most heated arguments over the smallest, most inconsequential things. It seems that the Christian church has not changed much in that regard since Paul's day. Paul makes it very clear in his letter that he doesn't have a problem with eating the meat. But he doesn't rebuke those who disagree with his position. Instead, he points at Judgment Day and says, remember who you are actually accountable to. Each of us is responsible for their own actions, and each of us will have to explain their own actions to our God one day. So if people do what you think is wrong, but it doesn't really harm anyone except your ego and possibly themselves, then don't go and make yourself judge over them. That is not your job. Ultimately, that is God's job. Let people make their own choices. Instead, be gracious and generous. Maybe they just need more time to figure it out for themselves. Or, and this is the more difficult option, perhaps it is in fact you, yourself, who hasn't figured it out yet. Maybe you are the one that is way too touchy about this subject. Maybe they have got it right, and you are the one who still needs to learn and grow. Focus on your own life and your own responsibilities first. And instead of looking for reasons to judge others or to confront others with everything that they are doing wrong, remember that you too will be judged one day for your actions. Don't make life more difficult for them, just so you can feel righteous and holy about yourself. I should point out that what Paul says here about Judgment Day does not seem to have anything to do with what he says about salvation. It is clear elsewhere that Paul believes in God ultimately accepting people through Jesus. Being confronted with your wrongdoings in front of God is not the same as being eternally punished for them. But it seems that Paul believed that a person who is a child of God and is loved and accepted into God's family forever still has to answer for the life that they've lived. And that makes sense. It is consistent with what Judgment Day is meant to be. I don't know how God will finally bring justice to each and every one who has ever lived exactly. But it makes sense that everything will need to be brought to light first, so that those who have suffered will be seen and heard. To be a Christian means to believe that God will ultimately set things right. And that will mean that on Judgment Day, my life will be looked at thoroughly, along with everyone else's. The injustices of this world cannot stand forever, because the people who have suffered need to be heard and seen. But it is also true that the one who will sit on that throne will be the one who loved humanity enough to die for them. The person on the judgment seat will be patient and kind and forgiving and full of love. And while God will do what needs to be done to make things right, I'm certain that God will do so carefully and with kindness and understanding. That does not take all the fear away. Being confronted with our own wrongdoing will still be difficult. I'm very sure of that. But ultimately, I think that it will be a healing and healthy thing to finally talk about everything that I have gotten wrong in my life and that has been going wrong in this world. And then, and that is the Christian hope, God will make it so that it will all be all right for everyone, forever. We don't know when this day will come. And we don't know what it will look like exactly. But in the meantime, I find it very sobering to remember Judgment Day every now and then. Because it reminds me that my choices matter. And at times it has given me the strength to be braver than I would have been otherwise. Because I remembered, if one day God asks me about this choice, what do I want to be able to say? Do I want to be able to say that I truly did what I could? Not out of fear for God's judgment, we have assured forgiveness, but because I want to live this life well. And on that day, I want to be proud of at least some of the choice that I was able to make with the help of God and the people around me. The other challenge in all of that is, of course, or all of this, what we've been talking about, is, of course, that there most definitely are things that we do need to argue about with one another. When a person in church acts unkind and unloving towards others and hurts people in the process, then to leave them be and to say nothing because God will judge them one day is not the Christian approach. That is why Paul says in verse 1 that this passage is regarding disputable matters. Unfortunately, it isn't always clear how consequential our actions may be. There will be moments where we won't know for sure, is this something I should address, or should I leave it to them, for them to figure it out for themselves? That is a great question to ask, by the way. We will, and we do get this wrong sometimes. We will at times argue over nothing, and unfortunately we will sometimes shy away from confrontation and argument that would have been absolutely necessary. So we will have to approach this with grace and patience as well. We have to be ready to forgive one another when we get offended over nothing. And we have to be willing to admit that our inaction can be very damaging also. This life is complicated. We will not. In fact, Paul says we cannot always get it right. Which is why it is a good thing that we believe in a God who is both forgiving when we get things wrong, but also ultimately just, so those that suffer are not lost and forgotten.